Good evening and welcome to the online screening of the Fairytale of Water. I'm Phil, I work with WOW, and we are delighted to have the filmmaker and storyteller, artist and filmmaker with us afterwards for a Q&A. We're really excited that we're able to bring this to you. WOW's Eco Cinema Film Festival. It's a starting point for creating creating conversations about people's relationship with their environment. We've had 3 UK premieres at Aberystwyth Arts Centre, and we're having 2 global premieres as well. The films are also all available online from today for 1 week, so please check out our website. You can find more details on there. I'm sure you have that already. And just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. If you can make sure you're all on mute, and then afterwards we are going to have, as I said, the Q&A, and there's several ways that you can participate, because really it's really important that you guys are involved. Just think we're all in the cinema together. Let's just pretend for this evening, even though it's nice and sunny outside. So you can, for the Zoom people who are familiar with Zoom, you can raise your hand digitally. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a tab called Reactions. If you click that, you can see that there's a little raise hand logo there. You can, thanks Fionn Phillips. And you can also just raise your hand on the screen and hopefully we'll catch that, although there's loads of you, which is great to see. Or if you're feeling a bit shy, you can just put your question in the chat box and we can make sure that gets to Peter and Jacob. I think that is all I've got to say. I'll pass over to Rowan. So without further ado, please, enjoy the film. And here's Rowan.
Thank you, Phil. So, noswaith dda, chroeso. Good evening. Welcome everybody. On behalf of WOW and Eco Cinema, I'd like to thank tonight's guests, Peter Stevenson and Jacob Whittaker, first of all, for making this film and making it available for WOW Film Festival to screen during our Reflecting on Water programme this week. So tonight is the global premiere of Chwedl Dŵr, the Fairytale of Water. And I'm just going to introduce Peter and Jake and ask them to introduce their film, before we all watch it together. So Peter Stevenson is a storyteller, children's writer, book illustrator, folklorist, filmmaker, cranky maker, and organiser of Aberystwyth Storytelling Festival and a Mabinogi project in collaboration with Aberystwyth Arts Centre. He has illustrated over 200 books and travelled widely, both wildly or widely? Widely, I think that was meant to say, both within Wales and internationally, researching his stories and performing. He's written books of Welsh folk tales, Ceredigion folk tales, and Welsh American folk tales. And he has a new book that's due to come out shortly, which complements Chwedl Dŵr. Jacob Whittaker's work includes sound and video installation, as well as documentary film for artists, often combining history and art, and recording everyday personal experiences of the people of Wales and their relationships to changing landscapes and culture. Influenced by the natural world, sacred geometry, and astrology, he seeks to connect the local and the universal with a sense of the interconnection between all things, in pursuit of understanding the interactions between thought and life, the real and the imagined. Born and raised in Ceredigion, he now lives and works in Cardigan. Both Peter and Jake can often be found tramping Ceredigion's lanes with mud on their boots, an ear for a story, and an eye for imagery to bring those stories alive. Working together, Jake and Peter have amassed an impressive body of work over the past decade. And if you'd like to explore their work further, we are going to post a link to their other films in the chat tonight, so look out for that. Chwedl Dŵr, Fairytale of Water, distills their water films into one concoction. It's a set of folk tales about water in West Wales, told through the old art of oral storytelling, but with the help of visual storytelling that paints pictures with water as well as with light. And now, Peter and Jake, before we press play, and I would like to highlight, there are two ways for you to watch the film tonight. We're going to screen it within the Zoom, but we're also going to post a link to Vimeo. So if you are, say, on your laptop computer, desktop computer, if you follow the link to the Vimeo, you'll be able to watch the film there in HD at the same time as we're all watching it here on Zoom. And I recommend you do that just to get, you know, the full quality experience. But now, Peter and Jake, if I can ask you to introduce your film, and congratulations on it, by the way.
Oh, well, diolch yn fawr iawn, Rowan, and thank you particularly for commissioning the film as well. It was a great honour to be asked to participate in WOW, and thank you, Phil and Gaz, who are doing all the technical things behind the scenes there. I'm not going to say very much, but just to reiterate what you said, what you're about to see, this is like a red warning, is oral storytelling. This is very different to written narrative, to the kind of narrative you would get in a novel, and it's also very different to a film screenplay. It's oral storytelling is this old Welsh word, chwedlau, which in parts of Wales in the past, it used to mean conversation, gossip, you know, stories, tales, old tales. It's now means legends and myths and fairy tales. And I rather like the idea that the two come under the same title as chwedlau, because, you know, certainly around here, the way I hear stories, I just meet people and, you know, it's kind of, you know, how's the neighbours, how are you doing, how's the foot, you know, and then you go into a myth and a legend, then back to gossip and, you know, telling tales that you can't possibly repeat anywhere else. And they're all become the same kind of thing. And also this is visual storytelling, as you also said, Rowan, which is where the reasons why Jake and I work together. When I tell a story, people think oral storytelling, well, you must know all the words. I can't remember words, but I remember pictures, and what I'm seeing are pictures in my head, and I'm speaking words that describe the pictures. And this is where Jake and I come to work together, because, you know, I can draw, I can illustrate, but I can't make the kind of images that Jake makes. So the reason we work together, not only do we have the same kind of views on the world, our work complements each other. And that's what you're seeing here, the imagery coming together with the oral storytelling. I'll just say one more thing as well about folktale. Folktale is a memory of events from the past, often very big epic events, which involve things like flooding and, you know, water inundation. And folktales are memories of these kind of things that have happened. But they're not just memories of real events. If I tell you that I had a dream last night where I flew through the air, and then I walk down to where I'm speaking to you now, one of those is a dream and the other one is true. And that's what folktales are. They're a memory of all these things from the past, and they don't have to be real, they can be dream. And that's where when people say, oh, is that story true? I kind of go. So again, thank you very much, Rowan. I don't know, Jake, if you want to say a few words as well.
I don't really have very much to add, other than it's been great working with Peter over the years, and this is really a lovely opportunity to sort of bring together these films in a single piece. And we had a really nice day a month or so ago up in Peter's studio, which you'll see in the film. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
If you have questions for Jake and Peter, please do pop them in the chat, or as Phil said, use the reactions button or just raise your hand, and we'll be scanning through and keeping an eye out for those raised hands. But I've got a few questions just to kick things off. So away we go. One thing I wanted to pick up on first of all was something that you spoke briefly about, Peter, in the introduction, and that's the process of taking an oral story and making it into a visual piece of storytelling. Can you talk us through a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Just very quickly though, I'm a bit bad at typing things in, but Emmy, thank you for your very kind comments. And yes, that was a key cork you spotted on top of the cranky. I'd also want to say, just thank Elsa Davis and Kerry Owen Jones. We didn't mention them at the beginning. They provided all the music, much of it old music from West Wales, and you also heard their voices in the film. And also, I think I noticed that Fionn Phillips is somewhere there in the audience. And welcome, Fionn, croeso. Just to say, to give you an idea of the kind of storytelling world out there, Fionn is the young storyteller of the year. Yeah, there you are. Hi Fionn. Fionn is the young storyteller of the year. Yeah, we actually have a young storyteller elected each year. So delightful to see Fionn with us. So to go back to your question, yeah, the processes. I mean, they are really complex. I think I'll start personally. I believe it or not, I was never particularly good at kind of work, even though I've written books and I've done so much study. I remember stories in pictures, and I think this comes from a very early age. The idea that when I was very young, we were on Penllyn, and a lot of my playground was Arrival, Trecairi, the Giant's Town, where you could look south across to Pembrokeshire. You could look west across to the Wicklow Hills. You could look north on a really clear day, which you didn't get very many of. You could actually see the Isle of Man and the Lake District. But also, as my parents told me, you could see Cantre'r Gwaelod of an evening. You could see the lights of the submerged city beneath Cardigan Bay. And you could also not see, but you could be told about Plant Rhys Southern, the Welsh utopia that's set up by the philosopher Rhys Southern, that was also in the centre of Cardigan Bay. But as a kid, whenever I used to go up to the top of Trecairi, there was usually a mist and you couldn't see anything. You could hardly see the nose in front of your face. But in my mind, I could see all these places. And to me, the Wicklow Hills and the Isle of Man and Pembrokeshire were exactly the same as Cantre'r Gwaelod and Plant Rhys Southern. Mythology and reality were precisely the same. And I learned to create images of these places in my mind. And I would create images of Ireland in exactly the same way I would of, say, Cantre'r Gwaelod, of the mythological places. And I think from that point on, imagery became really important to me. But as with every artist, we all kind of draw or we create images in our own way. So I can't create images in the way that Jake can, but Jake can interpret the stories that I tell in the way that I would like to. I mean, I do my, all the pictures in there were my drawings, but the images of the water were all Jake's. So sometimes we're all limited as artists, and sometimes it's important to collaborate, and it's why we've collaborated so long. And our process to do this has always been to go around together. Although Jake's the filmmaker, the cameraman, and I provide the stories, nonetheless, we actually walk the landscape, because anybody who knows about these stories will know each and every one of those tales is set in a specific landscape, a specific place. And when you go to those places, you can see exactly why those stories belong in that place. And okay, yeah, they can travel in the mind and on the voice of a storyteller or anybody moving from one place to another, but they only put down roots in a place where they want to. So stories are intricately connected to the land. So when we walk round and we spot these places, there's four eyes, two pairs of eyes, watching and looking. And very often I miss something that Jake spots. Jake spots something that I don't see, and vice versa. So it's almost like a kind of a double the person is interpreting this landscape. And we've always done that. We've always gone to these places. One of the stories in there, the story of the lady who brewed beer up in the Ceredigion Hills in the lead mines, we actually spent 2 nights right at the beginning of January in the freezing conditions up in near Llyn Teifi in a bothy. we had a bit of wood that we could light a fire, and we had Elsa and Kerry with us, so all of us were there, and dear Mark Hayes, who was always our technical assistant. The 5 of us crammed into this bothy, lighting a fire, huddling round it. We cobbled the food together. We brought a few tins with us, and you know, crack of dawn, we were out there filming, and some of those shots that Jake got were, you know, really early in the morning in the middle of January. So it's that might be an extreme, but we travel everywhere together to make these films. Maybe you want to say something, Jake, and I'll maybe come back and talk about Myra as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's very true. I mean, we always you often identify the locations, and then we go and we visit and we wander around, and it's through your knowledge of the kind of the background to the stories that I then spot things that might kind of echo some of those themes. And I think I was going to talk about a little bit about the kind of just the joy of filming water. It's just an amazing substance, and you know, artists working with light all the time, light and water combine. It's a dream, isn't it? So any excuse to point a camera at water is always welcome. But the other thing I think that's interesting with the work with you, Peter, is the fact that this landscape is very meaningful to me. You know, I grew up in this area, so those shots in Kaibach, that was the beach we used to go to. Shanina Church and the area there was where we used to pick conkers as kids. You know, that was, those horse chestnuts are still there. It was a really important place. So when I first heard your stories of those areas, it triggered all these childhood memories, and it was a really interesting process then to see these places in a different way and kind of have them kind of invigorated by these stories that were kind of familiar as well. I think I was saying the other day about how I have this inkling that some of the Ceredigion folk tales, that the Myra Evans collection, were actually told to us in primary school in Llanarth. Now I can't swear that that's true, like any good story, but it sort of, you know, it sort of triggers something around that. And the locations were really, it was just really interesting to see them as an adult again, but with this layer of childhood memory, and then the kind of childhood fairy tale-ness kind of coming back in. And yeah, I think that was really interesting. Yeah, I don't know whether more to say.
I think you did hear those stories, Jake, but I think it was probably through T. Jones. T. Fowle, you know, probably the most famous writer of folk tales and fairy tales in the whole of Wales, and T. Fowle was brought up in that, you know, very close to where you were brought up, and you know, he wrote so many children's books, and he would have been writing them at the time you were a little boy, and his
absolutely
passed into the folk tradition, and sometimes now it's very hard to distinguish his stories from stories that brought us together, which are the stories of Myra Evans. And Myra was born in 1883 in Caernewydd, in Newquay, central Ceredigion. And she, over the years, she collected all the fairy tales, all the oral fairy tales and folk songs that were told and sung by her family and by the fishermen, anybody. She would gathered all these stories together, and she amassed an incredible collection of material, which through meeting her youngest daughter about 10 years ago, I've been very lucky to go through that collection and see all this material. And some of the stories in that film came from Myra Evans, and she's a remarkable, almost barely known character within the country and within our tradition. And yet, she's probably as important to us here in Wales as, say, the Grimms would be in Germany and international terms. And it was, I think, the very first time Kerry and Elsa and I put together a show many years ago of Myra's stories with Myra's music and songs, the folk songs she collected, and we pieced them all together, and we debuted them for the first time in the chapel in the tabernacle in Caernewydd, and Jake and his mum, and Jake's mum was a brilliant storyteller, Liz Whittaker, wonderful storyteller, and they came to that very first show that we did, and that was the kind of beginning of our collaboration. So it was actually Myra, this amazing folk song collector and folk story collector, who actually brought us together.
Yeah, no, I remember it well. It was an amazing experience to see that, and that, as I say, just triggered all these memories and this kind of the urge to sort of pursue that and kind of and work with you, and lo and behold, there we are. Yes.
I want to pick up on something Jake said about the pleasure of filming water and water and light, and just think about, these are water stories, and what's the connection for you between water and creativity? There's quite a lot of painting and water's flowing within the film. On the cranky scrolls, on the brush.
I certainly got very intrigued by this idea because, I'm painting with water. Everything I do, the root of all my artwork is water.
Yeah.
I use watercolor, not oils. And I see Jake as Jake's actually a painter originally, and a painter with film. So I was the root of our tools and our techniques in the work we produce. And it does make me think as well, when I see these pictures in my head, I'm actually seeing water.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm not a trained filmmaker. I studied fine art, so that's my painting is my background, and so I still do occasionally paint. I've got a print there that is part of a kind of current obsession with circles, but often my visual sort of painted work was very reliant on water, actually. So I struggle. Otherwise, the control that you have is too great, and I tended to flood the page with water, so you can't control the marks as much, and that's really exciting. So I've discovered a sort of practice of improvisation and that carries through into the filmmaking as well. But it certainly was a big part of my painting practice and drawing practice, is to use water to sort of lose control, and it allows me to sort of lose control, and those. Its movement kind of is. I think we had someone in the discussion earlier talking about a painter who paints in the sea. I thought that was a fascinating idea of kind of allowing nature to sort of influence what you're doing in a very real way. And yeah, I think there's some parallel there of me sloshing water onto my drawings to sort of lose control and discover other things.
I certainly think that's something water can teach us generally in life, is living with that kind of unpredictability. It's a cliche, but going with the flow rather than trying to swim upstream. And I think we can kind of all learn a bit of resilience and flexibility through being with water. So these water stories, and these are also old stories, quite a lot of them, some of them newer, but why do you think the old stories are important for our future?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think it's the reason behind what I do. I mean, I'm not a historian, so I'm not interested in the stories from the point of view of them being old stories. They do need to have a meaning. They do have to have a purpose, otherwise they won't survive. I mean, there's been so many stories, millions of stories told in the past, and only a handful of them have come down to us that have survived the years, that still have a kind of relevance. And part of the thing I do is going back and finding stories from the past that you can see a relevance today. And very often, we talk a lot about environmental stories nowadays, and I'm not sure stories were told from that point of view in the past, but the point is they can be made into environmental stories now. So you look at one of our oldest stories is in the Llyfr Du Caerfyrddin, the Black Book of Carmarthen, so mid 13th century, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, I could say no historian, but that has a very short poem in it which praises this man called Saith Enin, who's a very well-known character within the storytelling world now, because he's the man who died in the flood that consumed Cantre'r Gwaelod, which is the land out in Cardigan Bay that's now below the sea. And in that very first poem, it's basically just a praise poem. Poets were employed to praise their masters. And it just says he was such a wonderful, great man. You know, he killed many people in battle and he was a great lord. And he drowned because the well maiden left the gates of the sluice gates open and drowned the land. So it was all her fault, which, let's face it, is not the nicest story to carry on. But as you trace the story over the years, you suddenly, other stories appear. They get joined in with that one. So suddenly a story appears saying that, well, actually this man was a drunk and he was trying to woo the well maiden and he was trying to drag her away from the sluice gate. So that's how the water came in. So in effect, it was his fault. They're all pointing fingers, trying to blame people. And you can trace this throughout the years. You know, in Victorian times, you get the bells of Aberdyfi, the idea that you get these, you know, the bells ringing below the water. And you get these layers all the way through. Until now, you know, a few years ago, Kenneth Matthews of Catatonia and Radio 6 wrote a really stunning children's book showing how that story and the flood behind it can tell of our concerns nowadays about climate change. So you can develop a story over the years and the good ones will survive and they're constantly being reinterpreted. The last thing you do is tell the story in the way that it was told to you. I think that was Mark Twain said that. I think he said the worst insult you could ever do to anybody was tell the story that they've just told to you back to them in exactly the same way. You change them. That's where creativity and art come in.
And Jake, have you got anything you want to add to that?
I'm not at the moment, I don't think. Sorry, I was just okay. Taking it all in.
Peter, I know you've travelled a lot overseas, and I was wondering, you brought in a couple of the stories that you've been told in New Zealand and in Seattle into the film. Would you say there are like more similarities or differences between how we relate to water here in Wales or the UK and how people in New Zealand or in the US, Indigenous people, relate to the rivers and seas?
I think this is one of the questions that's kind of consuming me at the moment. Whenever you travel anywhere, you can see the similarities. You can see the same kind of folk tales in different places. But I mean, personally, I think it's the differences that are more interesting because, as I've said before, these stories, wherever they appear, wherever they're told, it's like they put roots down and they find soil that they like and they find an atmosphere that they like, they find water that they like, and that's where they grow. And when they grow, they take on the feel of that specific landscape. So you can see the similarities, yeah, of course. I've been looking at the stories of the little people that we have here in Wales, Tylwyth Teg, with the little people that you find, well, you know, you've got them in Seattle, you mentioned you've got them in New Zealand as well. There are Maori stories of the little people. So you can see these parallels, but they are different. And it's those differences, that kind of local connection, the local landscape, the water that kind of makes them grow, and the land and the soil that makes them unique. And I think if we're just going to say, oh, it's similar over there like it is over there and same as here, I think we miss a great deal. It's about seeing these stories in the context of the culture. I often say if you just take a story without looking at the context of the story, all you have left is a text, the clash between context and text. But having said that, I think there's a great deal we can learn, and particularly there's been several places around the world really where you have, and it's where you have quite strong Indigenous voices. And I say that relatively because most Indigenous peoples are not particularly listened to, apart from those who've got the ears to hear, but where they have got quite strong voices. And Maori in the last 20 years have developed quite a strong voice in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And back in 2017, and I was actually there at the time this happened, the Wanganui River was poisoned, and I think virtually all the fish, there were just dead fish floating down the river. And the Maori, the local iwi, because these are all specific tribes, not Maori as a whole, went to the New Zealand government and said, look, this river needs protection. And the only way to protect it is to give it the same rights as a human being. And blow me, this was a Conservative government as well back in those days. It's not Jacinda Ardern, who so many people love over here. This was a Conservative government, and they gave the river the rights of a human being. Now, I think that's wonderful, but there are also issues with that as well, because we're kind of humanizing the river, which is not, I'm not sure that's quite the way to go about it. It's almost, maybe it's even better the other way around, to see that the river makes us into water like itself. And also you have these questions about, you know, is this the river between the banks? It's just the water. What happens when it hits the sea? Are the banks included in this? And you get this all across, there's other places around the world. But I think the idea of seeing water, river, sea as having the same rights as the rest of us, that nature rights, the natural world, I think that is definitely a way forward. And this is why I was focusing on the idea of avant sin adore in the film, to go back to this idea that I really do think we had in Wales at one time, that the water in West Wales was seen as a living entity in the very same similar way to we would perceive each other. So I think that is something we can learn rather than dwell on the similarities, and we can adapt those ideas to what we have here in the west of Wales.
Yeah, it's definitely our living seas, our living rivers. And it's important that we look beyond ourselves as humans and think about the way that other entities are alive also, and all interconnected. I think we're going to come round now to the chat. And are there any questions from the audience? Or perhaps even, I can see a lot of observations, so perhaps we can have a read through, because I'm aware Peter can't see the chat at the moment. So perhaps we could read a few of those questions and reactions, responses out, and get Jake and Peter's responses to those.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, everyone, for your enthusiasm and the great comments and quotes. And we've got a few questions, and again, beautiful to see the film. And I really loved, Peter, how you spoke about storytelling as almost an organic thing, and how you know, myth making and folk tales, you know, they are real memories. That's really helped me kind of solidify how I think about them. So yeah, I think we've got a very enthusiastic Claire Parry-Jones, who wanted to know more about the Swan story.
Yeah, well, there are several swan stories from down the west coast. There's one from Penllyn, from Llyn-Glasbryn. There's one from Gower. There's one from Barry Island before they built all the amusement parks. There's quite a few, and lots of references to kind of transformation into swans right the way down the west coast. So there's that particular one was a story I heard when I was younger, but I kind of blurred the Penllyn story with the Gower story. So they kind of come together really, and I made a cranky around the story. So again, it's like, you know, adapting old stories and feeling they're still quite relevant. Had I carried on with the story, you would have seen it's about the idea that we need transformation now to, you know, to get away from this idea that one person thinks they can own another one. You know, people can grow wings and fly, and should be encouraged to.
Oh, fantastic, beautiful. And this kind of speaks to the next observation slash question from Alison Stokes, which got me thinking as well. The post-industrial tales you touched upon, do they almost mirror the ancient tales a little bit? You spoke about how, you know, there's similarities, but it's important to be attentive and respectful of the differences as well. And I wonder, you know, stories, we can transplant them across cultures, across continents, but that one of the escaped ducks particularly touched me when I read about it a few years ago. So do you think, you know, there's some kind of resonance there with the modern story tales of post-industrial Wales and the older ones? Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, I absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I think I live not far, well, you know, we're sitting not far from Stratford, from Florida Abbey, and Llynnoedd Teifi, the Teifi pools, where we filmed the story of about the lead mine and the beer brewing. Llynnoedd Teifi was built as reservoirs back in the 1400s. So, you know, and then you look at, you know, we know all about Cofio Tryweryn now, and making sure we remember those people who were moved out of their homes so that the Tryweryn Valley could be flooded for drinking water for, you know, across the border. But of course, that was also going on in the 1880s, 90s. The Ellen Valley was flooded as well for drinking water for Birmingham, Liverpool, and Lake Vyrnwy as well was another one, which is now an RSPB reserve. You know, we look at somewhere which is conserving wildlife, but you look at the history of behind it, and you find this constantly throughout history. So my feeling about these old stories is they keep coming back, and they might get forgotten for a while, but suddenly something will happen and give them a relevance again. And I think that's what's happened. That's what I call the reservoir stories now, that, you know, our creation myths for post-industrial Wales. I think it's, they're the kind of same stories, but they gain a new relevance over time, depending on what's happening in the political world and in our social interactions.
Beautiful, and it's particularly relevant to water, you know, that recycles, that rewashes, that reflects and returns. And I think the metaphor there is very strong, this idea of echoes and reverberations. On a more practical note, again, Peter, but I think there's some stuff for you as well, Jacob, but Peter, a more practical note, Thomas Evans has asked, how do you come up with so many great stories? Do you revise the history on each? Or as you kind of lovingly quipped Mark Twain, do you kind of, you know, take a bit of your own kind of history and your own ideas into it? How do you do that? Do you do a lot of research?
I do. Hi, Tom, by the way. Nice to hear from you. And yes, I do. I do an awful lot of research. I actually got, many years ago, I trained as a folklorist, and, you know, we're a fairly endangered species in Wales now. There's not too many of us left. So moving into storytelling and illustration and the arts, I kind of saw folklore back then as an art form, and yet I was being taught academically. And I do love both disciplines, but it is trying to find that line in between the two. But that taught me research, which I've always found really important in everything I do. I almost can't create a piece of art if I haven't researched everything behind it. So, you know, if I hear a story, I do need to find out where that story's come from, what's created it, what the landscape is, the people, the history of that place, and people's thoughts as well, the emotions, everything, as much as I can behind it. I often tell a story. You know, walking the landscape around here, I suddenly hear a story. You know, it might not be a complete narrative, but something kind of stops me. I'm walking the landscape with a friend, and we both heard the same song at the same time, and we were in the middle of, you know, right out in the Ceredigion Hills, and there was no music playing, but there it was. And this happens constantly. And I then go to the National Library, one of my favorite places on earth, and, you know, do as much research as I can, go through books. And it's usually when I find the connection between, as I was talking about at the beginning, the real story and my kind of dream world, my kind of creative fantasy world. When those two things come together, I feel I've got a story.
Oh, fantastic, beautiful. Thank you so much. And Jacob, you know, we have storytelling as painting pictures with words, but there's something incredibly captivating about photography, and especially cinematography, moving images. And one of the things I really appreciated about the film is, if I can say it like this, you had the courage to hold on to a shot and let the images kind of reveal themselves and really hold on to things. And I think that's almost quite brave, especially in our kind of Insta age. So would you like to speak to that at all? How kind of looking at the landscape in that kind of long lens, sort of way informed the storytelling aspects of what we just saw?
Yeah, well, I think that potentially some of that comes from my background as an artist rather than as a filmmaker. As I say, I've never kind of studied filmmaking formally, and my filmmaking has come out of an art practice that used cameras as documentation. So they were literally set up and would run for hours documenting processes in the studio. So the long shots have never really worried me in my own practice. And yeah, I think there's often, I think there's room for them in these films. You know, this was I meant to say earlier that this work with Peter has kind of enabled me to explore narrative in a way that my work doesn't. My work is very non-narrative on the whole. So it's been really interesting to kind of fuse these two things of the very sort of, as you say, a static image or a singular image, along with a narration, and what happens there. And finding shots that can work with. And we have been very fortunate to have be able to work with Kerry and Elsa and Dayard. And you forgot Ailsa, of course, who provided the soundtrack on the Shani Podman film. And they're wonderful musicians, you know, so they're with their music as well. I think the quality of the content from Peter and from them allows me to hold those shots in some ways. And of course, the environment is just beautiful here. You know, we are in a very gorgeous part of the world. And I realized as well, when I look back to make this film, not only have I made this series of water-based films with Peter, but an awful lot of other work for other people and of my own practice involves water. So I will, I think we were going to post some links to the individual films that are shown in part in that. Yes. And over the next week, I'll probably put it's on my blog, and I'll probably put another post up with some of the other films. Because Peter mentioned Elan, and some years ago I did some work up there around the reservoirs. So we've got some, there's a lot of work there. So that might be interesting to people. But yeah, I think that might answer the question about the long shots. We should see more of them.
Absolutely beautiful, and yeah, thank you. And I think we've just shared on the chat box for everyone your blog, swimmingcatfilms.wordpress, and I think someone's asked if they can see the conversation later as well, and I think you can. We'll get a confirmation from Gareth, who's behind the scenes. Another question / observation from Claire Tilling, and I have to admit I kind of felt this too, and maybe it was helped. So this is to both of you, Peter, Jacob. This has helped with the amazing music, the kind of haunting music. And Claire's observation is that, you know, that wedded to the stories, and we're talking about stories of the past often, which have only just happened or maybe further in the mists of history. Claire's saying that she saw some of them maybe as ghost stories, and I wonder if there's anything there, the kind of resonance with you know, ghosted images, ghosted places that no longer exist, people that no longer exist. I mean, are in a way all stories ghost stories?
This is actually much more Jake's thing. I do think there's a great deal in that. We've had quite a few conversations about it. You know, the idea of ghost story. Also things like, I mean, I did that, the beginning of a Cranky story about Betty Grucker, who made the love potions. I don't know whether she existed. She's one of Myra Evans' stories. But Shani Podman, who was the lady who lived at K Bar that we did a little animation for. Now, Shani definitely existed. You talk to anybody in K Newydd and K Bar, and they know Shani Podman. And you'll talk to people there who will tell you, oh yeah, they remember her when they were children, but she died in 1917, so it's impossible. But her memory has lingered on. Now, the idea of leaving a memory behind as a kind of story, it's one aspect of ghost stories, I think. It's like, you know, people carry on in our minds, and there's an element of the idea of a ghost story in that. I'll actually leave this to you, Jake.
Well, I mean, I think you're doing that because I have another side project which deals with sort of paranormal phenomenon and how we treat it visually, and the kind of the visual side of it, really. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think that water does hold memory, and if ghosts aren't memories, then what are they? It's Yeah, interesting question. Not sure.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to be unsure as well, and I think that's what's so beautiful about a film like the one you presented is we're bringing myth, we're bringing story, we're bringing illustration, and it's okay not to necessarily have the answer. And I think one of the stories, forgive me if I'm wrong, kind of doesn't have a neat resolution, and for that I kind of like that, and I think that's also quite important and can be quite salutary. Okay, you know, it can sit with us and it might work its magic in different sort of ways. So I think that's also maybe an important thing. Are there any other questions that are coming through, Rowan, or anyone who's got any questions that maybe they'd like to appear on the screen so you can be on YouTube forever? If there's anyone out there that wants to wave their hand or put a question into the chat box.
Any other questions or responses, reactions that you'd like to share?
Oh, I see.
Great,
People
well,
turn their videos off now.
Yeah, don't record us. So I wonder then if we can finish up by asking Peter, because there are lots of incomplete stories within this film. Perhaps you could tell us, Peter, a complete story now before we all say goodnight.
I must admit, I was kind of toying with that, whether to put complete story, well, complete-ish stories in, or just have these little snippets every now and again. And because I like the idea that folk tales are memory, and you know, within memory and dream, we shoot from one narrative to another, and certainly when I'm thinking things through, I don't always finish my thoughts. I disappear off to something else, and I do kind of like that idea. And anyone who's seen me tell stories for an hour will know that I might stop a story and go into another one. And you know, you find some of the great old storytellers, certainly from this part of West Wales, it's how they work. You know, something triggers their mind and they'll stop the story they're telling and go off and tell another one, and then maybe half an hour later they'll come back to the one that they left behind. And I do kind of like that, and I wanted to get that a sense of that into the story. But I thought a few people, usually whenever I talk about Betty Grucker, which was the cranky story that I began in the film, most people want to know a bit more about her. And as I say, I don't know if she was a real character or not, but she feels very real to me. And she came from Myra Evans from Caernewydd, and she's one of there is this story about Betty, and again, like I say, I just like the idea of her. The places she lived in and the places mentioned in the stories are all very real, and they are still there to this day. So if you'd like, I will tell you the whole story as I know it. It's not that long. I'm just going to move my Vietnamese water puppet out of the way. But as you know, Betty brewed love potions, and I'm very fortunate to actually have some here, but maybe we'll come back to that later on. So I'm going to go back a little bit. Oh, so here she is, old Betty Grucker, lived at Bank Penrhyn, and she had, as you already know, 1,000 wrinkles around the eyes, a solitary yellow tooth that wobbled unnervingly in the breeze from her breath, and a single grey hair in the middle of her chin. And old Betty used the herbs from the woods to brew love potions. And there were queues of people waiting outside her cottage to get their love potions. And one day, the maid from the very posh house, Plaswen, came to get her love potion, and she brought with her a little baby, the baby of the squire of Plaswen, who she was looking after, a little boy called Cedric. And at exactly the same time, the maid of the rather ramshackle Riverberwick farmhouse also came for her love potion, and she brought with her a little baby called Elinor. Well, old Betty gave the two maids their love potion, but then, being a mischievous old soul, and as you already know from the film, she gave the love potion to the two babies. Well, Time passed. Time passed as it always does in fairy tales in this part of the world, in the blink of a crow's eye, or in the time it takes for an endless final heartbeat. 18 years in our world, and old Betty was still there, and she was as mischievous as ever. And she still had even more wrinkles round the eye. She still had her grey hair in the middle of her chin and that solitary yellow tooth that wobbled unnervingly in the breeze from her breath. And one day there was a girl walked in asking for a love potion. And old Betty was mixing up the potion from the bottles on the sagging shelves in her cottage when there was another. And a young man walked in asking for water. The second the eyes of the young man and the young girl met, they rushed into each other's arms and they were kissing, canoodling, fondling, making love right there in the middle of old Betty's room, right there on her flagstone floor. Well, old Betty took the poker and she put it between them so they couldn't quite reach each other. And she asked them what their names were. And the girl said her name was Ellie. And the boy said his name was Kedrig. Well, now, old Betty knew, as you know, that these were the two babies she had given the love potion to all those years before. So she explained that the young couple were doomed to be in love for the rest of their lives. But quite frankly, this didn't bother either of them. In fact, they were quite delighted to be in love, and they spent their next year making love in everywhere across Ceredigion, right on the seashore, on the cliff top, behind the National Library of Wales, in every hedge bank on the way from Lampeter to Tregaron. And after a year passed, they decided they would get married. So Kedrig went to see his father, the old squire of Plaswen, who, as you can see, was not the most amenable of old gentlemen, and he refused the marriage. He said he didn't want any son of his, marrying a poor girl from a ramshackle old farm. And Eleanor's father said he didn't want any daughter of his marrying the son of the stuck-up old squire of Plaswen. A feud began. Well, Kedrig and Eleanor did the career gwely, bedroom love. And Kedrig put the ladder up to Eleanor's window. She climbed down, they took a boat and they sailed north from Caernewydd all the way up to the one place in Wales where there was a preacher who would marry people who had eloped. Abermawr, Barmouth. They got married and they spent a very happy honeymoon in Abermawr before they returned to Caernewydd to discover that Kedrig's father, the old squire of Plaswen, was so angry he'd burst a blood vessel and he was 6 feet under the ground. So Kedrig and Eleanor inherited the mansion of Plaswen, and they filled that house with so much love and so many babies. So many babies, they couldn't even count them, and they certainly couldn't remember all the names. But old Betty, you might be wondering where old Betty is. Well, I can exclusively tell you now that old Betty is still there. She's got even more wrinkles around the eyes. She's lost the yellow tooth in the middle of her mouth, and the grey hair in the middle of her chin is even greyer and longer. And she's still brewing love potions. And it's said that dear old Betty is responsible for all the marital bliss in the whole of Ceredigion and most of the marital strife. I wish you a fond farewell with a little drop of Betty's love potion. Hwyl fawr.
Yakidar.
That was absolutely wonderful. Captivating. And oh yeah, there's so much regeneration and rebirth in the water, isn't there? It's thank you so much, Peter and Jake. And maybe we should spotlight Jake and Phil again before we all go. Great, thank you. It's been wonderful. The response from the audience tonight has really just brought home what a magical piece of work this is, and also your wider body of work, which this film has drawn upon. So I'd like to highlight to everyone Jake's blog post where the other films are available. So I've just popped the link there in the chat. Whittaker Fairytale of Water will be available on Vimeo for 1 week, so until next Sunday. So please tell your mates, let everybody know about it. And we'll also be putting a link to the recording of this Zoom and this Q&A up onto YouTube in the next day or two. Yeah, so do tell people about that. This is WOW's first film commission in a way. We've done film education projects together in the past, which Peter and Jake have both been involved in. But it's the first time we've taken the step of actually commissioning a film for the festival, and it's been a delight. So thank you so much for taking the plunge with us at short notice. What can you do, guys? Let's try and bring something together. It's been a joy. It is actually available globally, not just in the UK. So if you'd like to help export a little Welsh culture to the rest of the world, do share it as widely as you possibly can. Are there any other closing comments that Phil, Jake, Peter, you would like to make before we say goodnight?
Well, I'd just like to thank you enormously, Rowan. I love the fact that Wales One World Film Festival has been one of my favourite festivals ever since the very first one, and it's up there with my other favourite festival, which is Beyond the Border International Storytelling Festival, which I know some of the people here also go to. And I love the fact the coming together of these two festivals. But also, you were saying before about the bringing together of, you know, stories across the world, and I can't see many of the people who are here, but I can see my friend Judy Turowski from West Virginia, and it's just so lovely to see a friendly face from across the water, who of course I've not seen for 2 years. And nice to see you, Judy. Judy's a great storyteller from, you know, from Appalachia. So I love that idea of pulling people together. So thanks.
My Esicht and Patagonia. Esicht has just put in the chat that she's in Patagonia.
Oh, wow.
Diolch am ymuno â ni, Esicht. Thank you for joining us tonight. Jake, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we go?
Just to say thank you so much for having us. Really, it's been a real honour to be here, and I've really enjoyed having the opportunity to sort of revisit the work from Peter and kind of create this montage of them for WOW and do this. It's been great. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and watching and all your questions.
And can we post the Vimeo link in the chat again before we go, just in case people want to, because you've got to scroll quite a way back. So that Vimeo link will be live for a week, and then possibly you might have to head on to another festival to have the chance to see the film again. So do take the chance to watch it again in high definitions and see Jake's imagery, you know, in its full glory. So diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and nos da.